Thank you, Frank. It's very nice to be back at the Academy with all of you again. Frank, from the looks of this program, at least the graduating numbers, this is going to be brought to you tonight by the young and the rest of us. Can you really go home again? I want you to think about that. Can you really go home again? Novelist Thomas Wolfe wrote a book entitled, "You Can't Go Home Again." By this, he intended to convey what all of us have discovered who have ever tried to recapture the past. I hope I don't break your bubble tonight, but you can't do it. Returning to the old places and trying to rekindle those former relationships inevitably leaves an aching in the heart. Why? Well, either the people aren't there, or they and the places to which you return are so altered and changed that we don't recognize them anymore, and they don't recognize us. And so Thomas Wolfe says it's better to leave the past what it is, just a memory, because you can't really recapture it. I remember the first time that was impressed upon me was several years ago when my family and I, with my mother, went down to visit the old farm where my grandfather and grandmother lived when I was a boy. And I was going to take my kids and show them how to get to the cave just by going down the meadow. You know, real easy trick. I'd done it many times as a kid. I cannot convey to you the shock that came to me when I stepped out of the car, went over the edge of the fence that was still there, and the pasture was gone. Now there was a forest. And I thought I was in the wrong place. But I had to weave my way through these tall trees with my kids trailing along behind. Finally, we did find the cave, but that stuck in my mind for weeks afterwards. I couldn't believe it. Recently, I brought my kids back here on a weekend of home leave, because I was going to show them the school that I grew up in. But what did I find? I found there's only one thing in life that doesn't change, and that's change itself. The music building, the old wood frame music building where I used to sneak kisses from my then girlfriend in C sharp minor, thank you. Well, see, some things don't change regardless of the generations. They've torn the music building down. Well, I said to my kids, okay, I did more than just kiss while I was here. I lived here. Let me go show you my room. We went over to Hadley Hall. I looked in the window. No room. Been torn down. Walls are gone. It's turned into a worship room. I had a room down there where we hid the radio in a potted plant holder. Some of the people I cared about the most aren't here either. I've studied them this week. I've listened to Prof. Shaw on the tape. I've listened to my sponsors. Some of them are moved away. Some of them are waiting the Lord's call. You can't go home again. Or can you? I think everything that I've said is true, and I think it is generally the case, and you will find this out as you grow older and join the rest of us, that you really can't go home again, with one exception. There is one exception in life to the rule that Thomas Wolfe told in his novel, You Can't Go Home Again. And what's that exception? Where is the one place in all of this universe that change doesn't take place? There is one. And for the rest of the time I have tonight, I want to call your attention to that. Malachi said it well. God speaking through him in the 3rd chapter of his short book, and here are the words. I am the Lord, and I do not. What? Good, some of you memorized that in your Bible classes. I am the Lord, I do not change. And so, you, descendants of Jacob, are therefore not completely lost. It's that change that I would like to share with you for the next few minutes. Because that's the one place in all of life where it is possible to go home again. I'm indebted to a teacher of mine for the story I want to share with you. Not a teacher from this campus, but one in my college years, Jack Provancha. Some of you may know him. A flurry of excitement rustled through the servants' quarters like the swirl of a vagrant breeze through the dry autumn leaves. Abathar felt the excitement before he had heard the news. It was Caleb's sister Rachel who told him, her dark eyes betraying her private elation. Gorgon is back. Abathar's eyes widened, and for a moment his sullen lips relaxed into the semblance of a smile. He had had few occasions to smile during the past 3 years since his friend had left their valley. They had been years long with restless discontent and resentment imposed by the narrow confines of his father's estate. He desperately had missed Gorgon's companionship and their shared imagination of the adventure that stretched beyond those hazy mountains to the south of Elam. Gorgon was the eldest son of Jacob, the chief steward, and his wife Hannah. A strapping youth with black hair and glistening in the sun, deep-set dreamer eyes, and full lips that played easily with jesting and laughter. He was a general favorite of the servants, but especially of the younger son of old Ben Isaac, master of Elam. Friendly, outgoing, Gorgon had yet a hint of untamed colt in him as he shook his black mane and gazed at the mountains, or as he would throw his proud head and shoulders back as he shouted at the sky when riding among the hills. One day, he had abruptly left the valley, telling his father and mother only that he had to find out for himself what lay beyond those mountains. And for 3 years, no one had heard so much as a word. But now suddenly, he's back. Homecoming. The servants clustered about him. Men pounded him loudly on his broad shoulders, and his mother and sisters kissed his cheek and wet them with their happy tears. Abathar, youngest son of Ben Isaac, held back as befitted a son. Finally, he stepped forward to greet his older, taller friend. As he searched Gorgon's face, he knew that the bond of friendship was still between them, but he also sensed something else. Gorgon had changed. The other youth was heavier, with a new hardness in the lines around his mouth. His eyes seemed squintier, and there was something disturbing in the way he kept looking at Rachel, who stood hesitantly to one side of the group. Several days passed before the two young men were alone together. Abathar waited until Gorgon had left the other servants and was alone along the path that led to the cluster of oaks near where his father watered the horses. When he caught up with him, Gorgon laughed in his old way, throwing his arm around his younger friend. "Well, Abby boy," he said, "how you been, kid?" The flippant manner of the dress took Abathar by surprise. Not that his being a son of Ben Isaac had ever strained their relationship, but Gorgon, even from his childhood, had sensed the awareness of their differing roles in spite of the closeness in their friendship. After Abathar regained his composure, the words tumbled out of his mouth. Gorgon, what was it like? I mean, on the other side. I want to hear everything. What did you do? Where did you go? Tell me what you saw. Was it as exciting as we had imagined? Hold on, Gorgon laughed. Hold on, there's plenty of time. I'll tell you the whole thing when it's right. But I'll tell you, kid, it was something. You wouldn't believe the things I saw in Lakish. But tell me first about yourself. What have you been doing? Is the old man still riding you? Huh? During the weeks that followed, Gorgon told of the places and the sights that he had seen. As Abathar listened, his confidence began to grow, and finally he said, Gorgon, my dad treats me like a kid. I know. Bide your time. Be patient. I know what I'm talking about. Trust me, man. Soon it became clear that Gorgon had no intention of remaining there in Elam. It showed in the restlessness of his ways, in his inability to accomplish even the simplest tasks. Servants began to notice it in his patronizing airs toward them. And Rachel began to avoid him after that day in the kitchen. When he made an advance on her, she shuddered as she thought what her father and brothers would do if they knew. The household slowly began to sense an uneasiness. It wasn't big things, but little things started to disappear, silver coins. Then one time, a special knife with an inlaid mother-of-pearl handle was taken from Adab, Abathar's older brother's bedroom. Adab was mad because his favorite uncle Ahimaaz had given him that knife on his 16th birthday. One day, the chief steward of Ben Isaac came to him with the message that a large sack of gold coins had been stolen, and Ben Isaac could stand back no longer. He challenged his chief steward to find out who the culprit was and to bring him to justice. But even as he did that, he had a suspicion that the culprit was none other than Gorgon. The hot moonless night left no shadows where Gorgon felt his way through the courtyard to Abathar's room. Silently, he slipped through the open window to the side of the low bed on which the younger son of Ben Isaac lay sleeping. Placing his hand over the youth's mouth to prevent his crying out, he shook him, gently at first, and then roughly. Abathar's eyes opened in fright. Seeing the dim figure couched over him and feeling the hand over his mouth, he began to struggle. "Quiet, kid. It's me," came Gorgon's hoarse whisper. "Listen carefully. I'm leaving tonight. If you're serious about wanting to go with me beyond the mountains, meet me in the morning on the old road to Acor that bends around the Red Bluffs. I'll wait until noon for you. See you there, kid." With that, Gorgon's figure faded into the darkness as silently as it had come. For a long time, Abathar lay quietly, shaken by the experience. But his mind began to wander. He felt the pull of the alternatives. What was he going to do? On the one hand, there was all of the remembrances of his childhood. His brother, Adab, though they hadn't been close of late, he was a good brother, took care of him after his mother's death. But then on the other hand, there was that excitement of finding out for himself what lay beyond the mountains. Now's my chance, he thought. In the morning, Abathar went to his father. "Father," he said, "give me the portion of the goods that fall to me." Ben Isaac tried to reason with his son, but eventually he gave his son the portion of his inheritance because he could already see that Abathar's heart was beyond the mountains. Shortly thereafter, Abathar took his inheritance and journeyed beyond the mountains into the far country. I'm going to pass quickly over the months of riotous living. Can you hear? Can you still hear? No? Can you hear now? Oh, okay. We'll pass quickly over the months of riotous living that Abathar spent under the direction of the now dissolute Gorgon. The drunken orgies, the brothels, the bars, as his inheritance dwindled. Gorgon's suggestions at first troubled Abathar, and he frequently felt disappointed that the taste of the experience had not matched the anticipation. But as time went on, Gorgon made sure that Abathar had few sober moments for that kind of reflection. Ben Isaac deeply loved his son. The separation was painful, almost beyond bearing. Adab, the older brother, watched helplessly as day after day his father visibly aged, as the months stretched into years. His once tall and erect figure began to stoop at the shoulders. His hair, which only had a touch of gray when Abathar left, now was streaked from the temples back. But it was his face that bore most strikingly the marks of the old man's grieving. Almost daily, Abathar could watch those deep lines drawing out in his father's face. And as he watched it occur, he became more angry at what his younger brother was doing to his father. Ben Isaac eagerly pressed every stranger or passing caravan for some fragment of news about his son. Finally, he commissioned his servants to go by turns beyond the mountains to see how it was going with his son. He asked them not to pressure him to return, but by their presence to remind him of his father's concern. Several times Abathar and Gorgon surprised these servants and turned on them in anger. On other occasions, when he saw them hovering in the background, Abathar tried to ignore their presence and stifle his now growing resentment. The almost 3 years that had passed since Abathar joined Gorgon at the noon meeting had taken their toll. The succession of days and nights of dissipation had marred his once youthful countenance. The sallow skin beneath his eyes and around his mouth spoke of too much wine and too little sleep, and the waste of his physical resources. And not only that, but he was discovering that his inheritance was almost gone. One hot day toward the end of the 3rd year, Ahimaaz, the chief servant of Ben Isaac, returned to Elam in great haste. Quickly he went to Ben Isaac, and he bowed and he said to him, "Master, I have come with urgent news." "What is it, Ahimaaz? Do you bring news about my son? How is it with him? Speak up, man." "I'm told that your son is ill, sire. Although I didn't see him, I know where he is, and those who are acquainted with him say that he is sick and in great need. I came straightway to tell you, sire, for I thought you would wish to know. Shall I go to him and ask him to come home with me?" "Thank you, Ahimaaz," the old man replied slowly, obviously shaken by the news. "No, I will go myself. I will go to him myself. Quickly, get the things ready. I shall leave at once." Gorgon was just leaving the entrance to Ammon's gaming house when he spotted the figure of an old man walking slowly down the narrow alleyway between the side streets. His back was toward him, but even in that dim light and the narrow passageway, Gorgon could recognize Ben Isaac here in Lachish. He swore under his breath. Quickly, he went back into Ammon's gaming house and then left by another side door, hurrying quickly over the garbage and rubbish of that portion of the city until finally he came to the place where he and Abathar were staying. Entering the doorway into the darkened room, he went over to the side of the low bed on which Abathar lay in a drunken stupor. He shook him roughly. "Kid, Abby, wake up!" Half opening his dreamy eyes, Abathar stared at Gorgon blankly. "Go away. Don't bother me." "Come on, kid. You've got to listen. There's someone in town who's out to get you. Take this. You're going to need it." And from under his cloak, Gorgon took a fine Syrian knife with an inlaid mother-of-pearl handle and placed it into Abithar's hands, his fingers folding around the handle as he drifted back into his unconscious stupor. A few quick moves about the room, throwing this object and that into a tattered goatskin bag, and Gorgon slipped out into the night. It was already late when at last Ben Isaac found someone who would, for a price, direct him to the room where his son lay. As he entered the low door, stooping to avoid hitting his head on the lintel, he lifted the lamp before him and he peered into the darkness of that room. A low moan escaped his lips at the scene that met his eyes in the dim circle of light cast from that flickering oil lamp. The odor and the sight struck him at almost the same moment. Decaying food, human excrement, unwashed bodies, clothing mingled with the smell of sour, strong drink. Empty wine flasks littered the floor with the filth. In the corner, on what appeared to function as a bed, an inert figure lay on his back, breathing heavily through his open mouth. But even in the dim light, in spite of the dissipation that had robbed those figures of their youth, Ben Isaac recognized his son. The wretch who had led him to the hovel waited until the father recognized the boy and then dropped off into the background. Quickly, Ben Isaac knelt beside the bed, moaning over and over again, "My son, Abithar, my son, what have they done to you? Oh, my son." Abithar's heavy breathing gave no indication of response to the old man's presence. All through the night, the aged father remained at the bedside, seemingly unaware of the passage of time or of his own weakness. His gnarled hands straightening the ragged bedclothes and softly caressing the hair of Abithar. "My son, my poor son," he said, "could I but exchange places with you?" In that darkest hour, just before dawn, Abithar finally began to stir. Only an occasional word was audible as the anguished father bent over the form on the bed for even the faintest sound of recognition. "Out to get me." After a time, Abithar began to be silent again. His only movements now were his quiet but more rapid breathing. Suddenly, his eyes opened and then focused in wide terror. In his near delirium, the figure bending over him in the semi-darkness took on a sinister shape. Crying out in alarm, Abithar closed his hand tightly about the knife Gorgon had placed there. Raising it, he struck wildly at the threatening figure. Again and again he drove the knife deeply into the flapping, quivering body as it collapsed in anguish on the floor, and then lay still. The light from the dim oil lamp shone full on the aged face of Ben Isaac, where he lay crumpled in his back in a slowly enlarging pool of blood. The sight of his father's face thrust Abithar into full consciousness. The knife fell from his hand as he strangled the hoarse scream that forced its way to his lips. He stared in commingled horror and disbelief. "Oh my God," he said, "what have I done?" He cried as he buried his face in his hands, trying to blot out the nightmare. But it wasn't only the terror of the act, but it was the look on his father's face that Abithar couldn't get out of his mind. That look from the years of grieving. His senses reeling, Abithar quickly looked around the room to the place where they had kept their inheritance. Empty. All of his possessions were gone. Quickly, Abithar staggered to the door. Nothing was left. His childhood friend had taken everything. Abithar turned for one last horrified look at his father lying there in the blood on the floor. And then, with an awful shaking, sobbing moan, he stumbled out into the night. What Abiathar did not know was that although he had left his father for dead, his knife had failed to reach the vital spot. The old man hovered at the point of death from loss of blood when discovered, and he remained so for many days. But he eventually recovered enough to return to his home, where he told everyone who asked only that he had been fallen into the hands of an assailant. And there at home he continued to grieve in love for his lost son. One day, several months later, Ahimaaz, the trusted servant, came quickly to him. Ben-Isaac, he said, "Can you find my son? Would you go to Lachish? Would you see if you can find him? Tell him I love him. Tell him I want him to come home." It wasn't easy this time to find the son. None of his former friends had seen him recently or knew where he might be. But one day, after weeks of fruitless searching, quite by accident, or is there a higher law that governs such coincidences? As he was walking along the dusty road on the outskirts of Lachish, he observed a strangely familiar figure herding pigs in a nearby field. The figure appeared older and thinner and wore an only tattered tunic, but as Ahimaaz drew near, he felt certain that this swineherd must be Abiathar. Approaching him, he stood for a time gazing at the face, that face so familiar and yet now so changed. Abiathar seemed lost in thought. Finally, sensing the stranger's presence, he glanced toward him and then quickly away in the hope that his father's servant wouldn't recognize him. "Are you not Abiathar, son of Ben-Isaac of Elim?" Ahimaaz asked. No answer. "I know that you are," he continued. I've just come from your father in Elim, and I have a message for you from him. He told me to tell you that he loves you, and he wants you to return home." With a look of astonishment and disbelief, Abiathar turned to the servant. "You lie. My father is dead. You have come to trick me. I know that my father is dead. I know it." Ahimaaz stared into Abiathar's face for a long moment in silence, looking as the truth of what he said began to form in his mind. "How could you know that, Abiathar?" No answer. "But it is true, your father lives. He returned to Elim from this country near death, telling us only that he had fallen into the hands of an assailant. He wanted me to come and tell you, Abiathar, that he still loves you, and he wants you to come home." The son could scarcely believe what he had heard, but as he looked into the servant's face, he knew that what he had spoken was the truth. All of a sudden, the sorrow, the guilt, the shame, and the grief that had dammed up those many months broke into a torrent of tears, and he fell to his knees before his father's servant, crying out his confession. Ahimaaz put his arms around him as the younger man babbled out the whole tragic story, the tears of both of them now flowing freely as Abiathar cried out his sorrow and his repentance at what he had done to his father's love. "I have sinned against God and my father. Can I ever find mercy, Ahimaaz, with either of them?" "Oh, yes," the servant confronted him, "for there's only love, both in the heart of God and in the heart of your father. Come home, Abiathar." Ahimaaz returned in haste to Ben-Isaac with a full report of the finding of his son, of his low condition, but of his repentance and confession, and the boy's fears. At this time, Ben-Isaac revealed to his older son, Adab, the truth about the younger brother, and especially the boy's sincere repentance and transformation. And he told Adab about his own love for his younger son. The old man spoke of his longing for the boy's return. He also gathered all the servants of his household together. My son Abiathar was dead, he told them, but now he's alive. The news spread quickly throughout Elam. The younger son of Ben Isaac is returning home. Did you hear the news? All shared in the old man's rejoicing. Even the anger and resentment of Adab was somehow softened by the new look of joy in his father's face. Not wishing the neighbors or his household servants to see his son as Ahimaaz had described him, the old man sat daily on the veranda of the house, watching for the first indication of the boy's return. And then one day he sighted way off in the distance a speck moving very slowly toward Elam. Instantly, his father's heart told him, "That's my son." Mentioning it to no one, he hurried down the dusty road to meet the boy. Observing his father's approach, Abiathar stopped dead in his tracks. Silently, he began to go over his confession of asking for a servant's place. I'm no more worthy to be called thy son, Father. Just make me as one of the hired servants." But when he was yet a great way off, his father saw him, and he had compassion on him, and he ran, and he fell on his neck, and he kissed him. Abiathar started to stammer out the request, but Ben Isaac would have none of it. Quickly, he took off his own outer robe and threw it over the boy's shoulders. He took the signet ring off his finger, and he placed it on his boy's hand. Throwing his arms around him, he kissed him again and again, their tears mingling together. And together they turned and walked to the father's house. The tattered tunic of his swineherd son now completely covered by his father's robe. As they accepted the greetings and the cheers of the neighbors and the servants of the household, the son stood tall by his father. As they, the neighbors, saw only the father's robe, they knew that a son had come home. And the son, as he looked down, saw no longer the swineherd rags, but only the covering robe. And feeling his father's arm strongly around his shoulders and his signet ring on his finger, he knew that he was a son. And together they walked into the father's house. His house, arm in arm. There was great feasting and rejoicing in that household. All knew that what had been lost was now found, and what had been dead was alive again. The beloved son was finally home. There was a family again. And there was peace once more in the valley. Thomas Wolfe was wrong at one important point in life. Because God, like Ben Isaac, is constant in his care and his concern for us. The one place in all the universe that never changes, because that's true. My young friends, my colleagues, and my older friends. With God, you can go home again.